You are now listening to Nailed It, the Orthopedic Surgery Podcast.
Brad and Michael, welcome to the Nailed It Ortho Podcast. So happy to have you all on.
Yeah, thanks for having us. We're excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and pretty much what we wanted to do today is cover a lot of the big things on talking about kind of employment contracts. But taking a step back, what kind of got you both into this kind of healthcare attorney side of things? I know there are many different subspecialties, but what got you all into that, and what's kept you there too?
I guess I'll start age before beauty, as you probably wanted to say. Yeah. So my dad's a plastic surgeon. And when I graduated from law school in 1995 and got my first job at a big law firm downtown Dallas doing litigation, my dad kept putting a bug in my ear. And back then was the height of the kind of that doctors hate lawyers era. And it was lawyers, there was no tort reform. And so there was a lot of really aggressive lawsuits against doctors. And it fortuitously kind of led to my entire career because my dad had a really successful practice here in Dallas and they just wanted to hire someone they could trust. And so they hired me and gave me opportunities to help their practice before I really even knew what I was doing. I was, a baby lawyer. And so from that, I started seeing a passion for this type of work. And then also just opportunity. There was not at that time a lot of healthcare attorneys around, and in particular, not attorneys that represented doctors.
Yeah, my story is very similar in some capacity. Is that my father is an orthopedic surgeon, so and then my mom's side of the family were all dentists. So I was either supposed to be a dentist, and then my grandfather was also a general surgeon before he became a psychoanalyst. So I was supposed to be some type of doctor.
Right.
I was not interested in any of the blood and guts aspect. I knew that sixth grade on. But as my dad has always said, every family needs one lawyer, and he just keeps it at that.
Just one.
I ended up, yeah, exactly. And so I ended up being interested in the law many years ago and had many opportunities. And obviously having a father and family members all in the medical industry, it just was a natural fit, like Michael, to start working with some of my dad's friends, some of my cousins who then became doctors. So it's just over the years, we just kind of built it from there before Michael and I actually met in 2005.
Yeah. Hurricane
Yeah.
Katrina.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it brought you all together, Katrina?
It did. Yeah.
Oh, man.
Instead, I when the waters went away, my house was not there, but I had somehow floated all the way to Dallas. So I just kind of
There we go. There we go. Nice. Yeah. I know a lot of people after Katrina moved to Texas or Georgia. I don't know as many people that moved to Mississippi, but definitely a lot of Georgia and Texas people.
Yeah. Well, Mississippi got nailed pretty hard too.
Yep. That's very true. And so, you guys have been in this for a while doing this. And so what has changed? I guess we can focus on employment agreements. Have you all seen any drift and change over the years, just to maybe the way the contracts are written or the agreements or anything that has just kind of morphed as time has gone to modern day kind of contracts and different agreements?
Yeah. I mean, I've only been doing this for 25 years. Michael's been doing this about 300 years. So we'll have like different, he's probably, he'll talk about the stone that he's
Of course.
our contracts on. But
Yep.
for me, one of the biggest differences I noticed is when I first started this, I'd say 75 to 85% of the physicians we would work with were going into their own private practice. They were going to start their own practice, no matter what specialty they were in. They were either joining a group or starting their own. And that's been a major shift. I can remember when the first time I started seeing the difference in contracts where almost some is 50-50. And now the hospital systems, the large systems are still, that's probably when you're talking to young fellows, they're getting a lot large offers from the hospital system versus the private practices. I don't know if you saw something similar to that.
Yeah. Well, and I was just thinking a little bit even more literal when you were talking about the contracts and thinking that many years ago, a decade plus ago, when a doctor was presented with a contract, the expectation was that the doctor would sign it. Like they were to be thankful that they had a job and don't ask for anything. And so it made our job challenging because we had to contend with that. And we had to acknowledge that was the expectation that was sitting there by the practice or even the hospital system. And yet, we, of course, number one, wanted to make sure that our clients were eyes wide open. They understood what they were signing if they chose to sign it. And then two, how do you tactfully ask for changes if there's some alignment issues and try to, negotiate the contract. And I would say nowadays it's much more accepted that there's almost an expectation that a young physician will hire an attorney and that there will be a little back and forth before there's a contract signed.
Yeah, I'll add something to that real quick. Is the point on that is really understanding who you're negotiating with. So again, the large system contracts that we see or large hospital, there's some little areas they might bend a little bit on, but typically you'll hear the statement. How many times have you heard this, Michael? Well, that's our system contract. Every single doctor has signed that exact same document, and that's actually a lie because we've been around long enough to know that they'll do small appendixes or side letters, is what they call them. And then when you're joining a group, they might not have ever recruited a young doctor. So this might be the very first time they've ever brought someone in, and they're just as green as the young doctor is, except for whoever their counsel is, trying to figure out how to bring that on. And I agree with you, Michael, that over the last decade plus, we've definitely seen at least some openness to that. We know the horror stories of people who didn't do anything and they just signed it because they thought they had to. And that just, unfortunately, we could probably spend an hour alone just talking about some of those horror stories.
In a bit, I want to at least just spend a couple minutes just talking about some of those horror stories so people
Yeah.
know what can happen if if you're not, I guess, diligent with the process. With the private, the private contracts versus the hospital system contracts. You mentioned a little bit earlier that the hospital systems are, a little bit less a little less leeway that you may have when negotiating. And one of the things that I've heard is that at least when you're looking for a private place or you're looking at to get employed by a private place, that you want maybe some type of similarity between the contracts because that means that they may be all fair and that is less wiggle room for doctors. Is that necessarily true in your all experience, or have you seen it both ways?
I would say it this way, and you follow up with me if I'm not speaking into your question, but I think you have to acknowledge that there's a different market between a hospital and a private practice. Typically, a private practice is a business, and they're going to be driven by the economics of what they have, and of course, a hospital is too. But they're a system, and so you tend to see different compensation levels between private practice, well, smaller private practices and the hospital systems. Now, when you get into larger practices and multi-specialty practices, they start to look more and more like the hospital contract. But it really comes down to, and what you're looking for is understanding, your own goals as the young physician, and does that line up with whatever this opportunity is, both clinically and personally and business wise, trying to understand, where the employer is. And so if it's a hospital, understanding that dynamic and what they're wanting out of the relationship versus a private practice. And then you have to keep your eye on the market. Like, what are the normal contracts that are out there for this type of opportunity? And you can get yourself into a little bit of trouble if you're trying to compare apples to oranges and not acknowledging those nuances.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing to that is that comparison game can definitely get you in a really bad situation. So we've both seen the situation where your buddy got this contract that's paying him $500,000 a year. You're like, oh wow, every contract I want, I'm just as good as a surgeon as this person. And then you get a contract and they're going to pay you 300, and you're like, well, this is terrible. But you don't dive deeper, which is, well, actually, if with the way in which the ancillaries work and the way in which you potential have ownership, you're going to be making a lot more than that in just 2 years if you stay with them. So you have to be very careful. There's also bonus compensations that get involved. And I think this is kind of where you're going, Michael, is ultimately the very beginning, it's on each physician to do their own homework to really figure out what can they live with and what do they want. And often Michael might call it like the plan A, plan B, which is really what are the external forces like, that you're going to be driving you? What are the internal forces that, it could be, I want to get back to New York City because that's where I'm from, or I want to get back to Ohio because that's where my wife and I are from, or whatever it ends up being. That's going to be a force. But then internally, I have to make a certain amount of money because, oh my gosh, my student loan, I'd actually like to buy a car that actually works. There's a lot of things that happens when you get out with your first contract. And that's going to impact the burn of what you have to, in your mind, what you have to have. And we've definitely represented physicians that they had no debt when they got out. So they're blessed because their family could help pay for it. And they weren't married at the time. So they didn't have that pull from a family member wanting to buy that new car or new house. And they're like, you know what? I can take a really low salary, but haven't seen compensation on the backside because once get into the bonus pool, I'm going to be making tons more money. So those are the kind of things I think you have to be very careful about when you're trying to compare contract to contract or apples to oranges.
All right, and let's talk on, I guess, the extreme opposite side of that, where somebody's not even thinking about these things, and they just get presented a contract, and they're like, "All right, looks good," and signs it without getting reviewed by anybody. What are some of the, we're trying to avoid that for all the
Yes.
listeners here today. What are some of the, I guess, so-called horror stories that you all have, heard about, or maybe have helped, represent, somebody where contracts kind of went bad? Like, what are some of the things that we definitely want to avoid?
The horror stories we always hear are the fact that, hey, everyone signs it, you have to sign it. So you feel like there's no reason for you to review it at all. Or you hire your buddy that you've done forever, who's an insurance defense attorney, doesn't even know what they're looking for. I mean, anyone can sit down and read a contract. That's the easiest part. What you're trying to do is figure out what's not there or what is there and that's not normally not there. And again, luckily for us, we've just been around it for so long, we have ideas. So when you're kind of looking for that attorney, you want to find a healthcare attorney that actually understands healthcare contracts, not someone is a pure litigator or a pure real estate attorney or pure tax attorney, someone that knows what to look for in that. Another physician coined this. It was not us, but he's like, you spend $200,000 to $300,000 spending on your education, and you then go out and you sign that first contract. That's like buying a $300,000 car, not getting insurance. And so this physician's perspective was the money you'll spend on that attorney really analyzing it is going to be the same thing as getting insurance for that brand new Ferrari that you just bought. Of course you wouldn't go do that. And that was one of the things. And so we've definitely seen doctors, just the horror stories in which they get stuck and they're in a bad relationship, they have a bad non-compete, and then they can't move because they've moved their entire family to New York from California or vice versa. And then it doesn't work at all. And now what's going to happen when they want to leave? Well, they're going to force that non-compete against them. They didn't even try to negotiate it. And now they're either going to have to move their whole family out of the town or try to breach it and see if they get sued. I mean, it could go on forever. I know you have a good story on this one too, Micah.
Yeah. Well, I was going to just walk back, like pose a hypothetical question that I'll answer. Like, what's the goal when you get a contract? And, some people have their own expectations. Like, well, it may be that it's an evidence that I've got a job, so I'm going to sign it, or it's a contract and, because what I see on TV, I need to win. And so I'm going to go and, duke it out with someone that I'm going to be potentially partners with someday and try to win that argument and win the contract. Or what I would pose is the goal is you want to see if everybody's on the same page about what this relationship is going to look like. And so we call it alignment of expectation. And so if you think about the horror stories where someone signs just what they've been presented, that also probably means they didn't really read the contract and fully understand the contract. And just think about the risk that they're not going to be on the same page with the employer about, what this is going to look like. Because if they didn't really look at the contract, I mean, they probably did look and read, what the compensation is going to be.
Yep.
But all the other things, I mean, there's so many traps, like how's call coverage going to work? I mean, we've had relationships blow up over call coverage. We've had relationships blow up over seemingly little things like that. How are they going to be busy? How are, you're the young doc, come into this vibrant practice and, they want to send all the uninsured patients to the new guy. And you have no idea as the new guy, that's what the plan is. And your contract isn't going to say that. I mean,
Yeah.
it isn't going to say these are the types of cases you're going to get, but the contract is the platform to have conversations, both on topics that are kind of clinical and outside the contract, things that should be in the contract, with the ultimate goal of being on the same page. So every single one of our stories is because they're not at the end of it all kind of, on the same page. Because we all know, and this will be intuitive. It's not like once they're working together, they're walking around with the contracts in their back pocket and pulling it out every day to see what everybody agreed to. I mean, you put it, save it in your computer and you start living your life.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, and this will be easy, quick, easy story. So, any one of your listeners are, if you ever heard of Houston, Texas, I had a client that was there, very vibrant practice, and there was a hospital out of Lake Charles that was really recruiting her, very like throwing lots of ideas that had lots of money and lots of things. And so she was like, you know what? I'm from Louisiana originally. That sounds great. And I remember going through her contract, and every single reason she told me she was leaving Houston to go to Lake Charles was not in the contract.
Mm.
Every single reason. And I told her, I said, hey, why are you going there? She said, you don't understand that the docs all there love him. She did her due diligence, and that they have a need for what I do. And they say, you can trust this doc. I mean, sorry, you can trust the CEO of the hospital. And I said, great. But what happens if he leaves? And she
Right.
never would accept that as a fact. And unfortunately, she went all the way there. He was doing so well that he got promoted and moved to Nashville. They brought a new CEO in who disliked doctors, and all the promises that she had as to why she was there, their attorney just kept saying, it's not in the contract. We're not going to do it. So
Mm.
that's why it's so important that no matter how great of a relationship it is, if you're going to move, and again, in this case, it was not as far as moving halfway across the country, but if there's a reason why you're going there, and you have to then be okay. Unfortunately, in her case, she was okay of moving over to Lake Charles, but it ended up being not for any of the reasons why she thought she'd be
Yeah, and I think sometimes, or at least if you're going into it without knowing much, you may not know that you need to know to ask something or to have it, placed
there.
inside of a contract.
Yeah.
And I guess so what are some things that physicians, need to know before they sign a contract? Some of the things you just mentioned, like the reasons that they were, that specific situation, the reason that they were leaving probably should have been in that contract that for the place that she was going. But what are, say first time, getting a job, what are some things I definitely need to know before I sign anything? So yeah, the most stubborn person doesn't want to get a lawyer, but definitely should. But these are like the basic things you need to know.
Well, I'll start by reinforcing and then and talking about kind of the flip of what we just talked about. The number one thing is, uh, number one, to be super clear about what your goals are as a doctor. Like, what does it look like 5 years from now if this is successful? Like, what does that mean? And by the way, it may be I'm only here for 2 years and then I'm going to go start my own practice. It doesn't mean you're necessarily with this same practice or hospital system, but having that vision of yourself informs the rest of the contract. I can have
Mhm.
two of the same contract with two different doctors, and my conversations are completely different
Yeah.
because of that single thing. And then the second thing is, again, what are your goals with the contract? Are you trying to get alignment and make sure that everything, as much as possible in that agreement, aligns with your vision, which I think is what I would submit you're trying to do. And I'll go back to something I said. If you're trying to win the contract and get, as many favorable points that, your buddies all got in their contract, et cetera, that's where the trouble can get. And I have learned some hard lessons kind of via my clients over the years. So I remember when I was younger and a client really wanted to negotiate a contract hard. And so we were super aggressive and we were very successful in getting the contract. Well, what I learned upon reflection was that my client was aggressive because he had this sixth sense that it wasn't going to be a good fit. And so he figured out I may as well get everything I want in the contract.
Mhm.
And then he got there and it wasn't a good fit. And, 6 months later, he was calling me saying, I need to get out of my contract and move on. This is, you name the list of things that are not in the contract. I mean, it was relational, it was a toxic work environment, all those types of things. And so, you know, when you're negotiating that first contract, coming back to your question of things to look out for, if when you're about to propose negotiation changes to the other side, what I'll say is that if that piece of paper is figuratively covered in red with the amount of changes, it's a pretty good indicator that this isn't going to work. 2 years from now, the odds are that doctor's not at that practice, even if they work through everything. And so there is something to be said, that as they engage with the practice and connect on, what it might be like to work together. So there's clinical discussions. They may have scrubbed in together. They've been to the office. By the time it comes to a contract, and they've talked about things just naturally, that you're going to have a lot more alignment than, just than that, the random contract that is completely opposite of what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think the weakness that most people have is you look to the comp immediately. And you're so, then again, comp needs to be important. You're not going to go work for free. So I'm not saying that, but you're so driven by that, you don't think about what other benefits are there, or what type of insurance should I be receiving? What are the areas that I need to be worried about based on my specialty? So especially when you're dealing with potential ownership, because you're going to go into a joiner group. Do you address that on day one in the contract? If they're saying, hey, come join us because we want you to become an owner here. Well, let's have that conversation out. What does that look like? How do I buy in? Is it a 2-year commitment or 4-year commitment before I get there? And what does that look like? What type of ancillary, especially if you're a surgeon? So surgeons have these abilities to buy into ambulatory surgery centers, the abilities to have labs and imaging, depending on the types that you're going to do. And so if you're joining a larger orthopedic group, for instance, they might have all of those. And how soon can you buy into that entity? And what do those buy-ins look like? So you might be like, oh, this is great. And then you find out, well, it's a $2 million buy-in because it's so successful that if you want to be an equal owner, you have to put up $2 million. Well, I'm not sure if I want to do that. So again, these are the kind of conversations you need to start having. I think Michael's point was really well taken, which is, where do you want to be right away? And then where do you want to go in the future? And I'll give you one story and I'll be quiet after that. But
Go for it.
perfect example, what Michael said is, I had a plastic surgeon, and he and his wife were both from Ohio, and they're both from Columbus. And he had a employment agreement that had a very restrictive non-compete. And his entire dream was to open his own practice in Columbus one day. Well, this non-compete is not going to happen. It was very enforceable the way it's written. We said, look, this won't work for you if this is your goal. And he got another offer from Cincinnati, which is, just down the road, basically. And in that one, he knew that he want to get board certified. So this place was like a mill where they're doing a ton of cases. So he could do a ton of surgeries, and he really wasn't concentrating on the non-compete. So we focused in other areas that had to do with his before and after pictures, and other areas that had to do with termination after the fact, because we knew within 2 to 3 years, he was gone. And so we really didn't focus on those other aspects. And so we negotiated that contract completely different than if he had wanted to stay and try to fight that non-compete. So again, that gives you some ideas of, if you know where you want to go, it helps us focus on the areas to really, going back to, you're not winning, you're trying to find what is the thing that helps you succeed in your career.
And I would say, going back to your question, you're talking about first time contracts. What should I be looking for? And let's kind of break down compensation, because we know that's the first thing everyone's going to turn to.
Yeah.
Very true.
And so there's a way to look at that beyond the number on the dotted line, which, by the way, is super important. But anybody can read that, including the doctors. Like, they know if it says $500,000 a year, exactly what that is. Every compensation section, no matter who your employer is going to measure your productivity in some way. And that's going to be the tool by which you can understand what it looks like to be successful at this practice. And so if you're in a hospital system, it's likely that you're going to have an RVU system that is measuring productivity by your work RVUs or something along those lines. And so that's really going to be like, the number of cases you do is reflective of your quote productivity. And so that's a good understanding. Like, it's okay if I'm, taking all the trauma patients, because, even if they're uninsured, I'm getting compensated based on the work that I'm doing. You go to a private practice, and the measure of productivity is probably going to be collections, money in the door. It doesn't matter how many cases you do. If dollars don't land in the practice, you're not, quote, productive under that comp system. Understanding comp model and how they're measuring what your how you would be, quote, successful, and then aligning that up with what you think that's going to look like, starts to really reveal the opportunity that's there. And so, because there's going to almost most of the contracts will have some form of incentive comp available, and the hospital, even the hospital systems, more and more have adopted a collections based incentive comp, and so understanding the system, so you kind of understand going in, because ultimately, if you even go deeper than that, what's going to make you successful is how busy you get and how busy you can stay at the particular practice.
And I'm going to add one piece to that is understand that you, especially in a private practice, you get paid based on your collections. And so Michael keeps talking about being busy. I would say you can't be successful in this business at all if you don't have patients. So that's the first thing, right? But the
Right.
second piece is, who are the payers? So if you show up and you find out this group is on these incredible plans and you'll be part of that, and these plans reimburse at very high levels. So that's great to know, so that when a patient shows up and you sit down and you work your tail off and you do a surgery and it's $10,000, and that commercial payer will then turn around and pay you 8, great. So you're like, okay, good. I'm getting very close to what we're trying to build it at. But then the opposite is what we see sometimes, is when you show up, you're the young guy. So you're dealing with all the program, the federal payers and state payers. And so that same $10,000 surgery, you might only get paid $1,500. Well, same amount of time, same amount of effort, but you're getting paid a lot less. And so when you are speaking with those organizations, that due diligence of understanding what their contracts look like makes a big difference when you go into private practice. And as Michael said, hospital systems are a little bit different to RVUs because it's about different type of production that they're utilizing. But for those going to join a larger group practice, find out what their payers look like, because you can be stupid busy and still not make that much money.
And there's so many different ways that you could end up, quote, making money. And so I think of an example with a client of ours. He's an orthopedic surgeon and he lives in a rural area, and he signed a contract that essentially makes, 350 to 400,000 a year. And it's probably under market. And he has an opportunity to take call from a ton of hospitals because there's no one like him around.
Okay.
And he ends up making double that from his call coverage every year. And
Mhm.
so you look at what he makes every year, and he's above market for anyone, around the country for what he does. Yet, if you just looked at what his employment agreement said at the number that's filled in the line on compensation, you would think, oh, wow, this isn't that great of a contract.
Right. And a lot of great points that you just brought up there. One, definitely knowing the compensation model of where you want to go and how you get paid, that can factor into many other decisions. The payer mix. And one of the things that came up when I was actually kind of just looking and creating some notes for this was performance reviews. And I assume those are, when at some point during the year, they'll say, well, this is how you're doing. This isn't how you're doing. Is that something that you want in the contract, or is there something that is a red flag if that's not in there or if it says a certain thing?
It's funny. I wouldn't red flag it for not being in there, but you raised a really good point, which is, how do you know how you're doing? And I can tell you in private practice, most likely you're not getting performance reviews.
Yeah.
It's very collegial, or, everyone's busy. The guy that is the boss is also doing surgery all the time. And so it feels almost like a partnership the moment they open the doors together and are working together, because they're both, you know, doing the same things on a day-to-day basis. And I would say there's typically not a lot of really good feedback in that context. You will see a more formal performance review set up in a hospital or academic setting. And so it wouldn't flag me one way or another in the contract when I saw that, but I do ask the questions. The risk in a hospital or academic setting is that there's a lot of more players, and you want to understand what the dynamics are in those hospital systems. And so, there's the star groups. Orthopedics are the most profitable, and so they get treated like kings. And, or, there's some other groups that they're the stars of the show. And so you start to understand kind of the specialties place in that particular system, and then your own place within the system. And then if there's politics involved, those performance reviews can be kind of a little bit more of a negative than truly what they're meant for, which is to give constructive feedback.
Right. And so say, we've sat down and I've said, this is kind of the practice that I'm looking for. And they seem to have met, the different qualifications. And there's this, I guess, this term called letter of intent. Can you kind of describe like what that is? And I guess maybe some pitfalls with it, or maybe some advantages to it.
So a letter of intent goes by a lot of different names. You might even see it as a memorandum of understanding or a confidential this agreement. A lot of times it's that moment in time where hopefully the hospital system or the potential employer has really streamlined the important elements that will be in your contract. So that's the first big takeaway. So again, your comp and your benefits, they may reference whether or not you have a restricted covenant. So it's very general in some ways in which it doesn't have all the legalese that people get caught up on in the actual contract. Where if we are brought in, if bring your lawyer in, that's that point where if you are trying to join a big group, or trying to join a group and have ownership, or you're nervous about the restricted covenants, that's a good time to start really breaking down the LOI to customize it for what you want it to be, if you have that ability. So again, a lot of the large, if you decide to go in the academic realm, it might be a one-page document that then references 10 other documents and then says, we're giving you a job offer to be on faculty here, and you'll abide by these 3 different documents, which are, each 150 pages. And so it really does depend on who you're going to join. But I know that when we're drafting on behalf of the employer, we like to be very robust with it. So it's very clear, and we try as best we can set those expectations that Michael was referencing earlier. So everyone has clear understanding of what we're trying to accomplish here, because if we can't figure that out in a simple, I say simple, in a 2 to 5 page document, you're not going to be able to do it later on in your 15 to 35 page employment agreement.
Yeah. And I'd say another term you'll see is that it'll be called an offer letter. Yeah. Which you hear, they're all the same. It's essentially a summary of the important pieces of information to what would be in the employment agreement. A trap that you could fall into, because a lot of times we will get here's my signed LOI and I need to hire a lawyer, is number one, sometimes those letters of intent are actually binding the way they are. And so they're more stuck legally than they think they are, because they think they're just signing a letter of intent. And so you want to watch out for that. But then secondly, a more common problem is the young doc will say, I'm just going to sign it and then I'll hire a lawyer and negotiate it. But you're setting expectations when you sign off on that, and anything you try to negotiate that you signed off on in that letter of intent is going to be monumentally harder to make happen, because the expectation on the other side is that everyone's on the same page as it relates to that. And so then if you try to walk that back, it can blow the deal. It can be that significant of of an impact to the relationship.
Yeah. And I'll add, I can give stories. So when we're representing the employer and we're going back and forth, developing a strong letter of intent, and our clients are satisfied, they finally think they have the right person that they're bringing on. They've been negotiating it. Then they said, okay, send the employment agreement. And the first thing is when we get a call back from their attorney saying, well, my client was not represented during the LOI phase. We don't accept these changes. Well, as you can imagine, at that moment, the employer, your potential boss, is flabbergasted, which is, how are they supposed to know that you didn't go out and get counsel, that you were doing it by yourself, or you were using the wrong lawyer during that time frame? And they have now spent weeks or months recruiting you. And now this new lawyer is asking for things that they would never have given you in the first place. So it tends to very quickly ice out these deals, because they thought they had something. They then had counsel that start drafting the employment agreement. And now you're starting negotiating out the employment agreement versus the letter of intent. So it can be very challenging for the potential, your future employer, to move forward. That's why if you are going to negotiate, I definitely would say bring counsel in early on the LOI.
And speaking about early, how early is early? So say for example, I'm a fifth year as of now, and a lot of my co-residents or people in my same class are starting to go out and look for jobs. At what time should they, get in contact with a lawyer, at least have one, I guess, on the team? Should it be, okay, they sent over the contract, now it's time, or should beforehand they have a discussion, kind of similar to what we're having now? Like these are kind of the things that you need to be on the lookout for. And then they go and look and speak to different places and then they send a contract. Like what is a ideal time for somebody to, have a lawyer on their side?
I think that kind of the minimum is if you are honing in on an opportunity and you get an offer letter or a letter of intent, that's the time to call. I would highly recommend that before you've signed off on anything. It does, we can be helpful earlier on. So I'm thinking of, some examples where I'll have kind of a consultation with a doctor as they're beginning the process. And we'll talk about some of the things we've been talking about today. And really, my goal is to help them develop their own clarity about what they're looking for. And so a lot of times they will do that and then come back as they've honed in on a contract. Occasionally, when they're looking at 3 different opportunities and they need some guidance on, how to work through and potentially even negotiate those, we'll jump in a little bit earlier. So earlier meaning that there's still several contenders in play. But, I would say the most common scenario is that the doctor has found the opportunity that they're interested in, but has not signed off on, an LOI.
Yeah. And I'll answer it this way. The sooner the better. The reason, and I agree with Michael, if you're starting to narrow down that I really like these 2 locations, I think it's fair for you to pick up the phone and just have a 15, 20-minute conversation with that potential attorney saying, this is what I'm looking at. What can you do to help me understand what are the things I need to be considering? And at least you have that relationship so that once you do get the LOI, you have ideas of what you're looking for already because of based off that conversation. You might negotiate that LOI yourself. And one thing I tell every one of our clients, ultimately at the end of the day, guess who gets to live with that contract? You do.
Right.
You're the doc. It's not no one else in your family. You might have talked to your mom, your aunt, your uncle, and 5 other attorneys. Ultimately, you have to be happy with it because you're the one that gets to live with it, not anyone else. The hard thing, and I'm sure I'd love to hear Michael's thought, is when I get the phone call saying, I need to sign this tomorrow. Can you review it? And sometimes I can, but I don't think I'm helping you because the expectation has been made that you're signing it tomorrow.
Right.
So now you're either not going to sign it because you don't have any wiggle room to negotiate, or I'm going to tell you all the bad things in it. And you're going to be, the moment you sign it, you're regretting the fact you signed it because you didn't spend any time thinking through that process. So I'm not a big fan of the rush. So when you do have those opportunities, start speaking to counsel, get to know them, find out if they're a good fit for you. And then as soon as you feel like it's pretty close, bring them in. And if it's done correctly, it's not going to cost you billions of dollars. I know that's obviously every single resident I've spoken to or fellow I've spoken to, it's a concern. Try to figure out if there's a fixed fee that they can work with you on to make sure that you're not getting caught up in a large spending tons and tons of money. Because most of the time, again, as my dad told me when he was a resident, he made so little money, he almost qualified for food stamps.
Yeah.
So those charity in New Orleans, I don't know, y'all might be making more money.
I've heard the stories.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that when it's gotten to the stage where it's like, I got to sign it, as Brad was saying, all we can really do at that point is say, okay, well, I can help make sure you understand what you're signing, which I think has some value.
Yeah.
Because at least their eyes wide open going into it. And at least if there's a big gotcha in there that they didn't know about, they haven't signed it yet. But as far as negotiations and all that stuff is usually off the table at that point. It's, they're expected, the proverbial, I've got to sign this tomorrow. And you kind of walk through it and, they either sign it or they don't. It's hard to kind of open up negotiations at that phase.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully people listening to this don't fall into that trap of the last minute contract that needs to get reviewed. Hopefully you find, you get your attorneys a lot earlier. And, Brad and Michael, what are, just another question or two before we wrap up here. What is just, I guess, ballpark a reasonable price range to have an attorney look over the contract? Because, a lot of people are listening to this, like, okay, let me find somebody, but they don't know what is considered very high, what's considered very low. So what is this, I guess, this ballpark amount?
I'll go high first, Michael. So if you're spending $10 million your first contract, hire me. I'll help you if you want to spend that much. If
Right.
you don't, what would you say, Michael?
Yeah, I'd say it like this. I think you can reasonably expect and get good advice for most contracts if you're spending between $1,500 and $3,000. I will say there are plenty of people out there that will charge less than $1,500. And the questions I would ask is, are you paying that person to read the contract and tell you what it says? Because that probably is typically going to be representative of the amount of experience they have. And so, you know, I don't know. I mean, doctors are pretty smart. They've already read the contract and can read it. And so you don't want to, spend $500 and then have someone say, this says X, what do you think? And you're just like, well, what do you mean? What do I think? I'm a doctor. I need some guidance here and someone
Right.
to help me think through what should I think and what are the issues to think about. But I will also say this on the flip side, you want to be careful. I mean, you could have a best friend that sends you to, the prominent healthcare attorney at some, firm in a big law firm in downtown, wherever. And maybe it's an associate. So it's not, a partner. So you're like, okay, it's just a young attorney. They're at a big law firm and, they're setting up on an hourly system and they have a lot of resources, maybe not a ton of experience. And then you get a bill in the mail for $10,000 to get through the contract because, that's just the way big law works. And so I would end with this. I think you should always ask these questions.
Yes.
Always ask what's the cost going to be? What should I expect from this representation? And if it resonates and lines up and you kind of feel that connection with the attorney, then, that's a good indicator that it's a good relationship.
Yeah.
Yep. No, Brad, you gonna say something? Go ahead.
No, I was agreeing. And the only other thing I'd add in is, especially as a young dog, I'd see if they're willing to do a fixed fee for at least the initial analysis. I know that's something we do. And I know a lot of other attorneys like us who will do that so that, to Michael's point, you won't have that surprise bill because they didn't lock them down to an actual fixed fee. That makes a huge difference as to, again, now we're setting expectations for you and the attorney as to what you expect to pay them and what they're expecting to deliver to you.
Yeah. And any tips on finding, because Brad, you mentioned a little bit earlier, but you had mentioned the story of possibly having somebody that looked over a contract that didn't necessarily know what they were looking for. So any tips on making sure that you have a good attorney? Because most of us will just, just like you said, ask your friend, who do you know that's an attorney? And they send you to somebody, you're not really sure if they're good or not. So any tips on finding a good attorney?
I,
There's just word of mouth.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
yeah, use the internet, look them up, look up their website, Google them, and you can get a sense pretty quickly if they have. I mean, you want to look for, obviously a healthcare background and experience, but also, some business experience as well. I mean, if you find someone that, is a public health type healthcare attorney, they may not know contracts very well.
Yeah. And I'll add one more thing to that. Don't feel trapped by geographic controls. There are a lot of attorneys like ourselves who, just because we've been blessed to speak publicly for so many years, we have clients coast to coast and know other people just like us who do the same thing. So if you are sitting there and you're moving to, Ohio and you're like, I don't know any Ohio, but I heard that there's this guy over here in New Orleans that does these contracts and well respected. Find out if that person's ever looked at contracts in Ohio. Don't feel trapped by your geographic location. Again, I agree with Michael. Make sure that they've done this. Have they written articles about it? Have they done seminars on it? Just find out who's out there speaking. Because as Michael said, you can pretty quickly narrow down the 10 to 15 really good healthcare attorneys probably in the country that really know physician contracts well.
Awesome. Well, Brad, Michael, it's been a pleasure having you both on. Now, for our listeners that, that are interested or may have something coming up, how can they just kind of find or, tune in to the things that you guys have going on?
So we have our website is ByrdAdatto.com, and that can get you almost to anywhere, but we do have social media handles on LinkedIn and Twitter and Instagram. And then we have our own podcast, The Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. And that's on all the Apple, Spotify, et cetera. And obviously the podcast is educationally focused, and our website has a blog and has all of our contact information and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, we'll have a link to everything in the description so people can go and click and, find out some more information about you two. Again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I learned a lot. Hopefully everybody else learned a lot as well. And until next time.
Appreciate it.